Have you ever felt like a secret was lurking just behind you, waiting to pounce? In Willow Grove Park, anything can happen, especially on a sweltering summer evening when the air is so thick you can taste the tension. The ancient willows whisper rumors no one dares repeat, and that shimmering lake? Who knows what's really hiding beneath its surface, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to discover it. Riley Harper, a mysterious girl with a battered thrift store novel, seems like just another face in the crowd. But in just a few minutes, everything she knows will be turned upside down. Suddenly, a voice slices through the heavy silence, cold, sharp, impossible to ignore. What's a woman like you doing out here, all alone in a place like this? The words hit her like a physical blow, low and taunting, carried on a gust that stirred the willows into a restless shiver. Riley froze, her heart slamming against her ribs, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't heard their approach. No scuff of boots, no rustle of uniforms, just the sudden, eerie hush that fell over the park, as if the trees themselves had paused, bracing for something ugly. Slowly, she turned, her thumb still pressed against the open page, her eyes lifting to meet the figures looming over her. Two officers stood there, their silhouettes sharp against the fading dusk, their presence filling the air with a weight that made her skin prickle. The older one was broad-shouldered, his face carved with deep lines, the kind etched by years under a merciless sun and a worldview even harsher. His eyes glinted with a cold amusement, like a hunter sizing up prey. The younger one was lean, wary, his hands fidgeting at his sides, his gaze darting nervously as if he wasn't sure whether he was part of a threat or just a reluctant witness to one. Officer Caleb Holt's lips twisted into a smirk, his badge catching the last glint of sunlight, a cold, metallic gleam that felt like a challenge. Beside him, Officer Nate Carver kept his eyes fixed on the ground, his shoulders hunched, his fingers twitching as if he wanted to disappear into the earth. "I'm just reading," Riley said, her voice steady despite the pulse pounding in her ears. Her grip tightened on the book, the pages crinkling under her fingers. "I'm not doing anything wrong." Holt stepped closer, his boots grinding deliberately into the gravel, the sound grating like a warning. "Depends," he drawled, his voice dripping with condescension, each word laced with a mockery that made her skin crawl. "Got ID, darling? Could be loitering. Could be scoping the place out. You never know these days." Riley's jaw clenched, her eyes narrowing as she fought to keep her composure. "This is a public park." Holt let out a low chuckle, the sound rough and mean, like sandpaper on raw nerves. Funny how some folks think public means they can just sit around, looking all pretty, wasting space. She moved slowly, deliberately, her hand reaching for her backpack on the bench beside her. "I've got ID if you need it," she said, her tone measured, though her fingers betrayed a slight tremor, a flicker of the fear she refused to let take root. Holt waved her off, his smirk widening, his eyes gleaming with something predatory. "Nah, think we'll just take a quick look ourselves." Before she could react, his baton flicked upward in a swift, practiced motion, catching the hem of her skirt and lifting it. The air hit her skin, cold and invasive, followed by a wave of humiliation that burned hotter than the summer heat. It was over in a heartbeat, a fleeting, deliberate act, but the violation lingered, searing itself into her bones, a bruise no one could see. Riley gasped, stumbling back, her hands flying to her skirt to pin it down, her face draining of color as her book tumbled to the dirt at her feet, its pages splaying open like a wounded bird. "What the hell is wrong with you?" she shouted, her voice cracking but fierce, raw with outrage that surged through her like wildfire. "That's assault." Holt barked a laugh, unfazed, his eyes glinting with cruel amusement. "Assault. Relax, sweetheart. Just having a little fun. It's a slow day, isn't it?" Carver let out a strained chuckle, the sound weak and forced, before his eyes darted away, his throat bobbing with a nervous swallow. He knew this was wrong, knew it had crossed a line, but he stood there, complicit in his silence, his cowardice a weight as heavy as Holt's arrogance. Riley straightened, her spine stiffening not from strength but from refusal to shrink. Her eyes locked onto Holt's, burning with defiance, a fire that refused to be snuffed out. "You think you can do this to anyone?" she said, her voice low and steady now, each word a challenge. "You think you'll get away with it?" Holt's smirk didn't falter, but his eyes hardened, a flicker of menace passing through them. "Not anyone," he said, his voice low and deliberate, each word dripping with intent. "Just girls like you." The words landed like a match on dry tinder, igniting something deep in Riley's chest, a fury that mingled with memories of powerlessness, years of being told to stay quiet, to stay small, to endure. Her mind reeled, Images flickering like an old film reel, a foster home where shouts echoed off peeling walls, hands that grabbed too hard, promises that broke like cheap glass. But her heart knew exactly what to do. She reached for her phone, her fingers steady now, no longer trembling, her movements precise as she dialed. The call connected after 2 rings, the sound sharp in the heavy air. "Zoe, I need you," she said, her voice clear, urgent, cutting through the haze. A beat of silence, then a single word, sharp as a blade. "We're Willow Grove, the bench by the east swings. Hurry. Don't move," came the reply, firm and certain, a lifeline thrown across the distance. 10 minutes. Riley hung up, sat back on the bench, and smoothed her skirt over her knees with deliberate care, her movements a quiet act of reclaiming herself. She stared out at the lake, its surface rippling under the dying light, reflecting the last embers of a sun that seemed to burn for her alone. Her jaw was set, her eyes blazing, not with fear, but with a resolve forged from memory, from survival. Riley Harper wasn't just some girl in a park. 8 years ago, Zoe Carter, a black woman in a crisp blue uniform, had walked into a violent foster home and found a terrified 12-year-old Riley curled in a corner, her body pressed against a cold wall as if she could disappear into it. Zoe had knelt, her voice steady, her presence a shield. "You're not staying here anymore," she'd said, and those words had planted a seed of courage in Riley, one that had taken years to grow but was now blooming, fierce and unyielding. She wasn't afraid anymore, she was ready. In 10 minutes, Justice would roll into the park in a weathered Jeep, driven by a woman with braided hair, mirrored sunglasses, and a badge that still meant something. For now Riley waited, her phone gripped like a shield, her dignity wrapped around her like tempered steel. The wind stirred, rustling the willows, but not a single leaf dared to fall, as if the park itself stood in solidarity with the strength in Riley Harper's silence. The Jeep tore through the late afternoon haze like a storm cloud breaking open, its engine growling low, no sirens, no fanfare, just raw, unrelenting purpose. Zoe Carter sat behind the wheel, her eyes fixed on the road, her knuckles tight around the steering wheel, her mind racing faster than the vehicle itself. She'd promised Riley 10 minutes, she'd make it in 8. Her uniform was half on, a civilian jacket thrown over a navy shirt, her badge clipped to her belt, her boots still dusted from a morning spent running drills at the academy. Her hair, pulled into a tight braid, swayed slightly as she checked her mirrors, but her thoughts weren't on the drive. They were with a girl she'd met 8 years ago, a girl with eyes too old for her 12-year-old face, found crouched beside a broken radiator in a foster home that reeked of neglect and fear. The shouting foster parent, a man who called himself her uncle, had been no match for Zoe's calm, unyielding presence. She'd knelt beside Riley, ignoring the chaos, and said, "You don't have to stay here anymore." That moment had bound them, a thread of trust that had held through years of distance, through Riley's quiet strength and Zoe's relentless fight for what was right. Now, Riley's voice on the phone, steady but laced with a tremor of pain, had ignited a cold, dangerous fire in Zoe's gut. "He lifted my skirt," Riley had said, and those words had carved themselves into Zoe's resolve, sharp and unyielding. She turned off the main road, taking the park's service entrance, the Jeep's tires chewing through gravel as she bypassed the crowded lot. Through the gaps in the willows, she spotted the bench, Riley sitting rigid, her posture a mix of defiance and restraint, her eyes locked on the lake, as if it held answers to questions she hadn't yet asked. Her book lay abandoned at her feet, its pages fluttering in the breeze, a small forgotten casualty of the moment. The 2 officers stood nearby, their stances too casual, too smug, like predators who thought they'd already won, their laughter still lingering in the air like a stain. Zoe parked, cut the engine, and stepped out. She didn't slam the door or announce her presence with fanfare. She just walked, each step deliberate, each footfall a tick of a clock counting down to a reckoning. The gravel crunched under her boots, a steady rhythm that matched the pulse of her resolve. She stopped 10 feet from the officers, her presence commanding despite the lack of theatrics, her silhouette framed by the willows like a figure carved from iron. Her voice, when it came, didn't shout. It cut, sharp and precise, like a scalpel through flesh. Badge numbers. Now, both men turned, their movements slow, almost lazy. Holt's smirk widened, his eyes glinting with amusement, as if this were just another game he'd win. "And who are you, darling?" he said, his voice dripping with the same condescension he'd used on Riley. Zoe flipped open her ID wallet, the gold shield of internal affairs catching the light like a warning shot. "Sergeant Zoe Carter, off duty but not that off, names and numbers." Now, Carver stiffened, his hands twitching at his sides, his face paling as the weight of her words sank in. "Mom, we were just—" he started, his voice faltering. "Not talking to you yet," Zoe said, her gaze never leaving Holt, her eyes boring into him with an intensity that made his smirk falter, just for a moment. Holt's grin wavered, then returned, a mask of bravado. "Just checking a loitering call," he said, his tone dismissive, as if he could brush her off like dust. "Loitering?" Zoe's eyes flicked to Riley, then back to Holt, her expression unreadable. "She's holding a book, not a brick." Holt shrugged, his nonchalance a practiced act, his shoulders rolling as if he could shrug off the weight of her scrutiny. "We had reason." "No, you had a chance," Zoe interrupted, her voice like steel, each word a hammer striking an anvil. "Don't mix the two." A small crowd began to gather. Parents pushing strollers, their eyes wary but curious, joggers slowing their pace, their earbuds dangling, an elderly man in a veteran's cap leaning on a cane, his face etched with a quiet anger. Phones were out, their lenses catching the scene like silent witnesses, their screens glowing in the dim light. Zoe took a step closer, her eyes locked on Holt's, her voice steady. "Did you touch her?" Holt's jaw twitched, his smirk slipping, a crack in his armor. "She's lying," he said, his voice low, defiant. "Then you won't mind me pulling park footage," Zoe said, her tone even, unyielding. "Or your body cams. You're wearing them, right?" Silence hung heavy, broken only by the distant hum of the lake's ripples. Carver's voice came out small, almost a whisper, his eyes fixed on the ground, minds charging at the station. Zoe turned to Riley for the first time, her gaze softening but not wavering. "You okay?" Riley nodded, a tight, controlled motion, her eyes holding back a storm that threatened to break. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady, though her hands gripped the edge of the bench like a lifeline. The veteran stepped forward, his voice gravelly but firm, his cane tapping the ground for emphasis. "I saw it," he said, his eyes locked on Holt. He flipped her skirt with his baton, laughed like it was a game, like she was nothing. Zoe pulled out her phone, opened the voice recorder, and held it up, her movements deliberate, her voice calm but unyielding. "Let the record show officer refusing to identify. Suspected misconduct. Timestamped witnessed." Riley stood, her posture straight, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the tension like a blade through fog. "His name's Caleb Holt, badge 31478. His partner's Nate Carver, badge 3952. I memorized them while they laughed." Zoe nodded once, sharp and approving, a flicker of pride in her eyes. "Good." She turned to the crowd, her voice carrying without rising. "Anyone who saw stay. Internal affairs is coming, your words count." Holt's face tightened, a vein pulsing in his neck, his eyes narrowing with a fury he couldn't quite hide. "You're making a mistake," he growled, his voice low, laced with venom. Zoe stepped closer, so close he could see his own reflection in her mirrored shades, a distorted version of himself staring back. "No, you did," she said, her voice like ice. "I'm just here for the cleanup." She turned to Riley, her tone softening, her words a quiet anchor. "You're not alone anymore." Riley's eyes met hers, and for the first time, a flicker of belief shone through, a spark of trust that had been buried for years but was now rising to the surface. The precinct's walls were stark, sterile, like a hospital stripped of warmth or mercy. When Zoe Carter walked through the lobby of the 9th District Station, the air grew heavy, the kind of tension that made spines stiffen, conversations die, and eyes linger too long. Her full uniform was pristine, navy blue, pressed to perfection, her hair pulled into a regulation bun, her badge polished to a shine, her body cam blinking softly like a heartbeat. She felt the weight of every stare. Cops who saw her as a traitor for turning on one of their own, their resentment palpable in the way they shifted in their seats or avoided her gaze. They didn't like that she was right, didn't like that she'd brought one of their own to heel. Detective Elena Ruiz trailed behind, her steps measured, carrying a sealed evidence bag with Holt and Carver's badges and weapons, the plastic glinting under the fluorescent lights. They passed a bulletin board where Holt's Officer of the Month photo hung, his smug grin staring out like a mockery of the justice he'd betrayed. It'd be gone by morning, replaced by a blank space or a new face, someone who hadn't yet tarnished the badge. Captain Marcus Tate met them outside the interview room, his 60s frame limping from an old injury sustained in a long-ago bust, his patience worn thin by years of navigating the politics of the precinct. "Tell me it's airtight," he muttered, his voice low, his eyes searching Zoe's for any hint of weakness. Zoe's reply was razor-sharp, her voice steady as stone. "Video from the park cameras, witnesses, a kid's phone footage, A veteran's statement on the spot, solid. Tate sighed, rubbing his temple, his fingers lingering on the bridge of his nose. The union's blowing up my phone already. You've got enemies now, Carter. Then I'll know who to watch. Zoe said, her eyes unflinching, her resolve a wall no one could breach. Inside the briefing room, Riley sat across from an internal affairs officer, her posture rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles pale from the effort of holding herself together. She looked older than her years, as if one afternoon had aged her a decade, her eyes carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. Zoe cleared her throat softly, her presence a quiet reassurance. You okay? Riley's nod was firm, her eyes steady with a resolve that hadn't faltered since she'd stood up to Holt. I'm ready, she said, her voice clear, though her hands still gripped the edge of her chair like an anchor. The IA officer handed Zoe a folder, its pages thick with transcribed statements, time-stamped photos, and footage from Zoe's body cam. Enough for misconduct charges, he said, his tone professional but tinged with urgency. The DA wants more. Confession a pattern. Zoe tapped the folder with a finger, her expression hard, her mind already turning over the next steps. I'll get it, she said, her voice a promise, not a boast. That afternoon, Zoe sat alone in her office, a small, cluttered space that smelled of old coffee and determination. She combed through old files, her eyes scanning pages the precinct's digital database would never flag, complaints buried, testimonies ignored, black and brown women silenced by fear, poverty, or the system's indifference. The paper trails told stories the computers hid, stories of women who dared to speak and been dismissed, their voices reduced to whispers on yellowed forms. Then she found it: Keisha Wells, 2018, inappropriate search by Caleb Holt during a routine stop, case closed for insufficient evidence. The words stared up at her, a stain on the page, a truth the precinct had tried to erase. She dialed a number from memory, her voice steady, her purpose clear. This is Sergeant Zoe Carter, she said when the call connected. I'm calling about your 2018 complaint. The voice on the other end was guarded, sharp with old pain. They said it didn't happen. Said I was making it up. They didn't have what I have now. Zoe said, her tone calm but unyielding. I need your truth. And maybe your courage. A long pause stretched across the line, heavy with doubt and memory. What do you need me to do? Tell your story, Zoe said. And be ready to stand. Carver returned to the station later that day, pale and sweating, guilt clinging to him like damp cloth, his eyes hollow with the weight of his own complicity. He sat across from Zoe in a small interview room, his hands trembling as he spoke. I didn't touch her, he stammered, his voice shaky, almost pleading. But I didn't stop him. I laughed, thought it was a joke, thought it wasn't my place to say anything. Zoe's gaze was steady, not cruel but clear, cutting through his excuses like a knife through fog. Do you know what your silence cost her? She asked, her voice quiet but heavy, each word a weight he couldn't shrug off. He nodded, his eyes dropping to the table, his voice barely a whisper. Yes, ma'am. Then don't waste it, Zoe said. Speak. He did, his words spilling out like a dam breaking. Locker room taunts, Holt's habit of targeting women he thought powerless, specific dates, places, incidents that matched other complaints buried in the precinct's files. He gave enough to link 3 old cases, enough to paint a pattern no lawyer could whitewash, enough to make the truth undeniable. By nightfall, Zoe stood before the city oversight board, a thumb drive in her hand, her presence commanding despite the simplicity of her stance. Her voice was like iron, steady and unyielding. Justice doesn't come with trumpets or parades, she said, her eyes locking with each member of the board. It comes when someone refuses to look away. That someone was Riley Harper, who remembered her worth and who gave it to her. Because she refused to stay silent, we have a chance to root out not just one offender, but a culture that let him thrive. The room was silent, every eye fixed on her, the weight of her words settling like stones in a still pond. No one clapped, but no one looked away either. Willow Grove buzzed with a quiet unrest that rippled beneath the surface. At the corner barbershop, old men folded their newspapers slower than usual, their eyes lingering on headlines about the park incident. At the diner, servers paused by tables, catching snippets of hushed conversations about justice and accountability. At Miss Lena's laundromat, where secrets were rinsed away with bleach and softened with drier sheets, something rare happened. Women began to speak, their voices low at first, then bolder, their stories weaving together like threads in a tapestry. Zoe stood in the doorway, dressed in jeans and a fitted coat, her steel gaze unchanged, her presence a quiet invitation to be heard. She wasn't here to interrogate, only to listen, to bear witness to truths too long buried. Keisha Wells arrived, 32, her short hair framing tired but sharp eyes, her hands clutching a worn purse with frayed edges. She sat stiffly, her posture guarded, her voice wary as she spoke. "This isn't for the press, is it?" she asked, barely meeting Zoe's gaze. "I don't do press," Zoe said, her voice steady, her eyes unwavering. "I do truth, even when it stings." Keisha's jaw flexed, her fingers tightening on her purse. 5 years ago, Holt pulled me over for a tail light. Said I looked nervous, made me get out of the car. Touched me where he shouldn't. I froze, like I always do when I'm scared. I filed a complaint. They said I was lying, said my story didn't match officer behavior. Zoe nodded, her hands still, her expression calm but attentive. They said that because they didn't want it to be true. Keisha's eyes lifted, meeting Zoe's for the first time, a flicker of hope breaking through her wariness. Why now? Why are they listening now? Because Riley wouldn't stay quiet, Zoe said, her voice soft but firm. And because I remembered you deserved to be heard. Keisha exhaled, her shoulders easing slightly, a small nod signaling her resolve. Okay, I'll testify. In a cramped records room behind the 9th District Station, Zoe sifted through dusty files, the air thick with the scent of old paper and forgotten truths. The files were a graveyard of complaints, redacted reports, unsubstantiated claims, anonymous testimonies, the same phrases repeating like a curse. Miscommunication, officer acted within protocol. But one name stood out, repeating like a stain across the pages: Caleb Holt, Caleb Holt, Caleb Holt. She was building not just a case but a pattern, a web of evidence that was harder to dismiss than a single story. Later that evening, Zoe met Riley at a quiet tea shop run by a Vietnamese couple who called everyone "sweetheart" and remembered your order after one visit. The air was warm, scented with lemongrass and jasmine, a safe haven wrapped in soft light. Riley sat with her legs folded, her hands wrapped around a warm mug, her eyes clearer, less haunted, as if she were learning to breathe without bracing for pain. "There's a girl," Riley said quietly, her voice steady but heavy with purpose. "She messaged me after the story broke, said Holt harassed her at her school bus stop when she was in middle school. Asked her if she had a boyfriend, stood too close. She's scared to go to the police." Zoe's jaw tightened, her fingers pausing on her own mug. "Is she willing to come forward?" Riley shook her head, her eyes distant. "Not yet. She's still afraid. We don't rush her," Zoe said, her voice calm but resolute. "But we don't let her disappear either." Riley looked up, her gaze hardening with a purpose that hadn't been there before. "Why do they always think silence is safety?" Zoe's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "Because they've never heard what silence sounds like when it breaks." City Hall stood like a fortress, its marble floors and polished brass railings designed to silence voices rather than amplify them. But that morning, truth came anyway, carried on quiet feet, in calm voices, through the trembling hands of women who had waited too long to be believed. Riley sat near the front of the council chamber, her back straight despite the tremor in her fingertips, her purpose clear, not to relieve pain, but to break a wall, to ensure no one else had to sit where she had sat, alone on that bench, unsure if anyone would believe her. Beside her, Keisha Wells held her own story like a burning coal, knowing it could finally light something greater than grief. At the far side of the room, Zoe leaned against the back wall, not as a speaker but as a guardian, her presence quiet but unshackable, her work woven into every document submitted, every witness listed, every tape cued to play. Chairwoman Alma Hayes, a black woman in her late 60s, adjusted her glasses and called the hearing to order, her tone firm, grandmotherly, and tired of excuses. "We're here to review misconduct allegations within the 9th District," she said, her voice carrying the weight of authority. "This is not a trial, but it is a reckoning." Riley spoke first, her voice steady, each word deliberate. He didn't yell or use force. That's what made it worse. He smiled, made it seem like what he did was normal, like I was nothing. I stayed quiet because I thought no one would care. But then Zoe showed up, and I remembered that sometimes justice isn't loud, it just shows up and refuses to leave. The room was still, the air heavy with the weight of her truth. Keisha followed, her voice shaking but unbroken, her eyes fixed on a point beyond the council. 5 years ago, he pulled me over for a tail light. Said I looked jumpy, made me step out, searched me in a way that made me feel less than human. I filed a complaint. They said I was exaggerating, that my story didn't line up. I wasn't exaggerating. A woman in a red scarf stood, her voice trembling but clear. I remember him from high school. He stood too close, asked for my number at the bus stop. I was 13. I didn't come forward because I thought it wouldn't matter. Another woman stood, then another, their stories weaving a tapestry of pain and resilience. Holt's name echoing in their memories, a predator hiding behind a badge. Zoe stepped forward, placing a folder on the council table, its pages thick with affidavits, time-stamped complaints, and Carver's transcribed confession. Hayes looked through it in silence, her eyes hard, her jaw tight. For years, these halls dismissed patterns as coincidences, she said, her voice low but resonant. That ends today. A murmur of assent swept the room, not loud, but heavy with the weight of something shifting, a crack in a wall that had stood too long. Outside, on the steps of City Hall, Zoe and Riley stood in silence, the morning haze softening the skyline. That was brave, Zoe said, her voice quiet but warm. Riley shook her head, her eyes distant. It was overdue. How do you feel? Zoe asked, her gaze steady. Riley looked out over the city, her answer coming with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. Like I'm finally standing in my own name. Zoe nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. That's the crack. Once it starts, the wall doesn't hold. The courthouse in downtown Willow Grove stood like a monument to old promises, the word justice, carved in stone above its columns, mocked by years of broken trust. Inside courtroom 30B, every seat was taken. Survivors sat shoulder to shoulder, some who had spoken, some who still couldn't, all here to bear witness. Reporters lined the back wall, their notepads silent, their screens dimmed. At the defendant's table, Caleb Holt sat in a suit instead of his uniform, but his arrogance remained, his tie straight, his eyes cold, his lawyer overconfident. To him, this was just a storm to wait out, another policy violation that would end with a slap on the wrist. But at the witness stand, Riley Harper sat with her hands folded, her voice level, her eyes steady. I was reading, she said, her words clear, unadorned. He asked for my ID, and before I could respond, he used his baton to lift my skirt. He smirked, like it was funny, like I didn't matter. The defense attorney leaned forward, his tone sharp. Miss Harper, did he physically touch you? No, Riley answered, her voice unwavering. He didn't need to. What he did was about domination, humiliation. He didn't have to touch skin to leave bruises. A ripple of tension passed through the room, the kind that didn't need a gavel to echo. Keisha Wells took the stand next, calm in a soft gray sweater, her posture composed, her voice steady. 5 years ago, he pulled me over for a tail light. He said I looked nervous, made me step out, searched me in a way that stole my dignity. I filed a complaint. They dismissed it. The truth hasn't changed. The defense objected, calling it irrelevant history. The judge overruled, her voice firm. Pattern is admissible. Carver followed, clean cut now, his hands trembling but his resolve firm. I laughed when it happened, he admitted, his voice heavy with shame. I was scared of him, didn't know what to do. But that doesn't excuse it. I failed to protect her. I failed my badge. The prosecutor, Nia Brooks, a middle-aged black woman with a presence both firm and graceful, closed with quiet power. This case is not about a single incident, she said, her eyes sweeping the jury. It's about a man who used his badge to prey on the vulnerable, who believed women without power had no voice. He was wrong. Today you have the chance to prove it. Holt never took the stand, his lawyer advising silence, knowing the mask was already cracking. As the jury deliberated, Zoe and Riley sat in a waiting room just outside, the hum of vending machines the only sound breaking the silence. No uniforms, no media, just two women bound by a shared truth. You did everything right, Zoe said softly, her voice a quiet anchor. Riley stared ahead, her hands still. I don't feel brave. Bravery isn't about feeling, Zoe replied. It's about what you do when you're afraid. Riley let out a long breath, her eyes distant. What if they let him go? Zoe didn't sugarcoat. They might. But even if they do, the silence around him is gone. He'll never hide in the shadows again. The door opened, and everyone rose as the jury returned. 12 faces, a paper passed to the bailiff, then to the judge. She read it aloud, her voice steady. On the charge of misconduct under color of authority, guilty. On the charge of harassment with intent to degrade, guilty. On the charge of abuse of power, guilty. Riley didn't react, not right away. Her hand simply unclenched, her fingers relaxing, as if they'd been holding her breath for years. Holt didn't look at her, his spine too weak to meet her gaze. Zoe did, her expression unreadable, a quiet strength radiating from her. You stood, she said, her voice low, and the world seemed to shift. Outside, the sky had turned gold. Not a celebration but a quiet light, a promise kept. The sound of Holt's cuffs wasn't loud, But it was final, the absence of his protest speaking louder than any shout. Reporters swarmed outside, their questions buzzing like flies, but Holt said nothing, his pride shattered long before the verdict. Inside, the courtroom held a weight too heavy to be called relief. Not joy, not triumph, just release. Riley sat back, breathing slow and deep, like someone adjusting to a new kind of air. In her hand she clutched a folded note from a little girl who'd watched her testify, written in blue marker. "You're the reason I believe girls can be brave." Zoe stood near the exit, arms folded, her face unreadable. She'd seen convictions before, seen guilty men walk free, but this was different. Not because it was rare, but because it had required ordinary people to do extraordinary things just to make the truth visible. Detective Elena Ruiz joined her, removing her glasses, her voice low. 18 months. Think it's enough. Zoe didn't flinch. It's not about the time. It's about the stain. His badge won't shine again. Carver exited through a side door, accompanied by internal affairs, his plea deal sparing him jail but costing him his patrol duties, his rank and his pride. He stopped as he passed Zoe, his voice quiet. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope what I said helped." Zoe studied him, her expression neither cold nor forgiving, just real. "You didn't save her," she said, "but you stopped lying. That's a start." He nodded and walked away, his footsteps fading into the evening. Later, Zoe and Riley returned to Willow Grove, not for ceremony or symbolism, but because the place where it began deserved to be seen in a new light. They walked slowly past the bench, its wood weathered, a small mark still visible where Riley's book had fallen. Riley traced the armrest with her fingertips, her touch gentle, as if reclaiming the space. "You ever think it would end like this?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "No," Zoe said, her eyes on the lake, its surface calm now, reflecting the stars. "But I never thought you'd be the one to finish it either." Riley gave a soft, dry laugh, her eyes bright. "Neither did I." She sat on the bench, not carefully this time, but confidently, her posture open, unafraid. "Can I tell you something strange?" she asked, her voice thoughtful. Zoe nodded, sitting beside her, the bench creaking under their shared weight. "I don't feel angry anymore," Riley said, her gaze distant, her words measured. "I thought I would, but now I feel clean. Like I finally stepped out of something I didn't even know I was breathing in." Zoe looked at her, a long, quiet moment passing between them. "That's what injustice does," she said. "It becomes the air. You don't notice it until someone cracks a window." Riley turned her head, a faint smile breaking through. "You cracked it." Zoe shook her head, her voice warm but firm. "You kicked it open." The breeze moved gently across the lake, cool and clean, carrying the scent of earth and water. Riley leaned back, her hands resting lightly on her lap. "I've been thinking," she said after a while, her voice carrying a new kind of purpose. "What if we created something, a space for girls like me, women like Keisha, even ones who aren't ready to speak yet? A place to breathe, to be heard." Zoe's eyes softened, a rare smile curving her lips. "What would you call it?" Riley stared out at the lake, her expression thoughtful, her voice steady. "Maybe The Stand. Because that's all I did, really. I stood." Zoe nodded slowly, the weight of the moment settling between them, a quiet earthquake. In the distance, the streetlights blinked on one by one, casting a golden path home. Behind them, the bench remained, quiet, ordinary, unchanged. But they had changed, and nothing about that was small. 3 weeks after the verdict, the leaves in Willow Grove had begun to turn. The great maple at the park's heart blazing a soft orange, shedding its leaves like it was letting go of something heavy. Riley sat beneath it, on the same bench where everything had begun, but she wasn't alone anymore. Children laughed in the distance, their voices bright and unburdened. Joggers passed by, their steps steady, their presence a reminder that life moved on. Riley held a folder in her lap, its edges creased, its pages filled with notes and names, a blueprint for something new. On the cover, hand-drawn in black marker, were 3 words: "The Silent Stand." A soft voice pulled her from her thoughts. "You really named it that?" Zoe asked, approaching with 2 paper cups of coffee, her steps slower now, more reflective. She'd requested reassignment from active internal affairs duty to a new role, community liaison for survivor support programs. The title didn't matter, the mission did. Riley looked up, a small smile breaking through. "It was never silent," she said. "I just didn't know how loud it was until someone listened." Zoe sat beside her, handing over a cup, her movements deliberate, her presence a quiet anchor. "You've got sign-ups already," she said, nodding to the folder. 36, Riley replied, her voice steady, her eyes bright with purpose. "Most are high schoolers." A few older women too. They said they'd been waiting years to speak, just needed someone to go first. Zoe leaned back on the bench, her gaze on the lake. That someone was you. Riley shook her head, her smile soft but resolute. I was scared. Still am, sometimes. That's how you know it mattered.